Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nina von Diller-Walden, Managing Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, a national organization now celebrating its 15th year, is a sponsor of Scholar Circle. We're a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs and materials. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, lay or professionally led. For more information, please visit our website, chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president and authored a best-selling book, Conspiracy U, a case study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories on the left and right of the political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book along with the accompanying curriculum, which has been taught to hundreds of college students and others for only $18 on chaimitzvah.org. The curriculum was also taught in a recorded series by Dr. Andrew Pessin, tonight's esteemed scholar. You will receive all this information in our follow-up email as well. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues of the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. We're excited to continue the Scholar Circle program as we enter our second year, and we need your support to keep it thriving. Scholar Circle has engaged over 2,000 participants this year alone. Your contribution will enable us to continue bringing international scholars to you at no charge to share their experience on the evolving Jewish world in the aftermath of October 7th. Please help us reach our goal of $40,000. To donate, please visit chaimitzvah.org, click on the Gold Scholar Circle menu tab, and select Support Scholar Circle. This information will be included in our follow-up email as well. Thank you for considering supporting this engaging program for all. Our featured scholar is Dr. Andrew Pessin, professor of philosophy and Jewish studies at Connecticut College and campus bureau editor of the Allgemeiner. His many books include Anti-Zionism on Campus, Poisoning the Wells, Anti-Semitism in Contemporary America, and The Jewish God Question, as well as several novels. One recent novel is Nevergreen, a satirical and now clearly prophetic account of campus cancel culture, its ideological excesses, and its deleterious impact on the Jews. Long ago, he enjoyed some moments of fame portraying the genius on the David Letterman show. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. A link to the lecture recording will be sent to you in a few days and will also be available on our website, chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Andrew Pessin.
Thank you, Nina. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone who's managed to come tonight. Let me get the slideshow up. Second. There we go. I trust that everybody can see that. There's my contact information. If you're interested in campus anti-Semitism issues, and who couldn't be in the last couple of years in particular, please follow me. I'm on Twitter at Andrew Pessin. I have a Substack, so if you want to keep up with some of my writings, you can follow me there at Pariah is my handle, or just Google me. I also run a Facebook group for many years now called Anti-Zionism on Campus. If you're on Facebook, join us there just to continue to document and discuss the sort of burning issue of our times. And as Nina mentioned, I'm campus bureau editor for the Allgemeiner. It's a wonderful news outlet that focuses on Jews and Israel and issues concerning those topics. Please go to allgemeiner.com and sign up for the daily newsletter. It's perfectly free, and it's just, most important thing is to stay informed, to stay abreast of what's going on, and the Allgemeiner is a wonderful way to do that. And there is my website, so you can find out everything you need to find out about me, including that novel Nevergreen, which would be a wonderful and very timely Hanukkah present, which really managed to capture the campus scene even before the campus scene captured itself. So do check that out. So tonight's topic, a new kind of response to anti-Israel claims. Uh, um, those who've been following this series and are familiar with these issues are familiar with many of the talking points they come to be called, because you get to hear the same ones over and over and over, and they're important and you need to know them, of course. But every once in a while, it's nice to come up with something new, which is what I'm attempted to do, a different kind of argument today, which not everybody loves, but I hope I will persuade you to at least check it out. We have a quote there from an MIT student who became well known last year as her campus exploded after October 7th. This was very early. This was probably October or November of 2023. I was forced to leave my study group because my group members told me the people at the Nova Music Festival deserved to die because they were partying on stolen land. This was just a tiny fragment of how uncomfortable things became for Jewish students prior to October 7th, but especially post October 7th, and of course to this day. Now, it may have been 2023 when this massacre occurred and when campuses erupted in the way that we're all familiar with. But the campus responses to October 7th show that for many, it's still 1948, the year that the State of Israel was established. Many campuses, as we know, exploded even in outright celebration of that horrific massacre, invoking by way of justification the massacre's context or root causes, for example, in Israel's occupation, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, etc., and invoking the legitimacy of resistance to those evils by any means necessary. Even many who didn't quite celebrate the violence invoke the same by way of explanation of it, bleeding into justification of the massacre. And many of those who remained silent about October 7th were no doubt thinking the same when they said such things as the following, which one of my colleagues said to me when I asked why she had remained silent days after this massacre. She said, "I need to learn more about this complex situation before rendering judgment." Now, normally, after watching armed men tie up a mother and father and their three smart children and burn them alive, you don't need to learn more to determine who the bad guys were. But hey, it's complex, as they said. I've argued elsewhere that the silence amounts to complicity, to borrow the popular expression that many progressives apply everywhere except to themselves. You're basically in favor of what happened on October 7, 2023, or you're against, in other words, and silence entails the former. But now this shocking campus response itself has its own context and root causes. In my view, the 20-year-long BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which amounts to a campaign of lies against Israel, combined with the more recent explosion and expansion of progressivism or wokeism or DEI, whatever you'd like to call it, has all amounted to a campaign to delegitimize and dehumanize not just Israeli Jews, but all Jews, the Jewish people. And the clear success of that dehumanization campaign explains why so many were apparently unable to see that the torture, mutilation, rape, and murder of babies, children, pregnant women, disabled, and elderly is a straightforward moral atrocity. If every Jew is fundamentally guilty, then their torture and murder is not merely permissible, but obligatory. If every Jew is guilty, then nothing you do to the Jew can make the Jew a victim. That's what we saw on campuses, the campus response after October 7th. But what does that have to do with 1948? That dehumanization campaign, in fact, rests ultimately on the claim that the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel was a massive injustice. If that establishment were perfectly just, then the efforts to prevent it then, and the nearly 75 years of continuous resistance to it since, would be unjust. In turn, many of the measures that Israel has taken over the years that the detractors cite as the root causes, such as oppression of Palestinians, subserving occupation and apartheid, etc., those would be seen not as illegitimate aggressive measures of domination, but as legitimate reactive measures of self-defense. Just take two examples, the security barrier along Western Judea and Samaria, and the blockade on Gaza that was instituted after Hamas took over by a violent illegal coup back in 2006 or so. Detractors call the security barrier an apartheid wall, and they say of the latter that it made Gaza into an open air prison, quote unquote. But to those who see the establishment of Israel as perfectly just, those amount to legitimate defensive measures which are justified by the unrelenting violence directed towards Israeli by Palestinians, hence security barriers, what we call it. So if Jewish sovereignty in that region is legitimate, in other words, then Jews are ordinary human beings with the ordinary human rights, including the right to defend themselves by walls or blockades as need be. But if Jewish sovereignty is not legitimate, then Jews are simply evildoers who, per campus dehumanization, lack even the basic human right to defend themselves, and all such measures are seen as aggressive mechanisms of oppression. On that view, every Jew is guilty and therefore worthy even of the atrocious harms of October 7th. And Hamas is not a genocidal Jew-hating terrorist group, but freedom fighters fighting for decolonization. So if 1948 is just, the establishment of Israel is just, in short, then 2023 is a terrorist atrocity. If 1948 is unjust, then 2023 is political liberation. So 2023 really still is about 1948 and certainly is in the minds of the anti-Israel activists populating so many campuses. Now, in response to that, clearly Zionists, pro-Israel folks need to continue and double down on disseminating their narrative, it's a popular word, the true narrative, the one that's grounded in the long Jewish history in this land, refuting these claims, defending the justice of the establishment of Israel, all of which can be done, has been done. I've done multiple times, including in lectures in this series, and that has to continue to be done. So when I talk about a new strategy or an alternative strategy, I don't mean to substitute for the old strategy. Old strategy is essential, has to keep going. But what happens is when you get into a debate or an argument with an Israel hater, within minutes, you're talking about 1948 again. And it's very, very frustrating. So this new strategy is meant to short circuit that and keep the conversation more focused. And so the new strategy, just to give it a sort of provocative label, is this: grant them most of what they falsely claim about the establishment of Israel. This particular idea has gotten some very good Zionist people upset. They don't want to grant anything. So I want to make it clear, we're not really granting it for the sake of argument momentarily. We will deny most of those false claims precisely because they are false. But in order to circumvent the conversation always going back to 1948, momentarily, for the sake of argument, let's grant most of what they falsely claim. Jews were settler colonists, outsiders who, via ethnic cleansing, came in and took over the land that became the state of Israel. And it's hard to even say those words, grant that, I understand that. Just so bear with me, please. Even if so, I suggest, even if we grant that, the campus anti-Israel movement of 2023, 2024 is morally objectionable. And once we see that this movement that aims to undo the Jewish state by any means necessary, including removing its supporters from all campuses, once we see that it's morally objectionable, then we can see it for what it really is, a campaign of dehumanizing hate that grotesquely leads its proponents to see the mutilation and murder, mass murder of Jewish children as somehow being the moral high ground. So let's begin to explore why. Even if we grant 1948, it's still morally objectionable. The child as a metaphysical and ethical fresh start. We're going to do a little philosophy in this lecture. We'll start with a repulsive practice that occurred for a while shortly after October 7th. Activists not just ripping down the posters of Israeli hostages that were put up in various places, but instead replacing their kidnapped headings with the word occupier. There are photos, as you see here, of a sweet little kidnapped 8-year-old girl and the Bibas children, including the baby, labeled as an occupier. A baby who was born in this land, very probably to parents who were born in this land, very probably to parents who were born in that land, and so on, possibly stretching way back, is an occupier. This is, of course, the perfect symbol of the idea that every Jew is guilty simply by virtue of being born. In contrast, consider how refugees and immigrants are considered in pretty much any other country in the world. Someone moves to Canada, let's say, and maybe in time starts to feel like and become a Canadian, but their children born there are largely raised as and feel Canadian, and certainly their grandchildren. Three of my own four grandparents immigrated as refugees from Russia to the United States, and my parents, and certainly I myself, feel as American as can be. One or two generations is more than enough generally for assimilation and legitimation. Anyone who claims otherwise, who tells the children or grandchildren of an immigrant that they don't belong here, would instantly and correctly be branded as a racist. Well, the people who put the word occupier on the photo of a baby are saying that no matter how many generations his family may have lived in this land, even if their family is one of those whose roots go back 2 or 3 thousand years to biblical times, then that child can never belong there. They may as well put a target right on her head, which of course is exactly what Hamas did. Now, what exactly is so repulsive about this practice, besides, in addition to its obvious racism? It's that that little girl is entirely innocent. That little 8-year-old girl in that poster, for example, she cannot be blamed for anything that may have preceded her in this world. She is simply not responsible for the alleged sins of her parents or grandparents or great grandparents, any more than the small child of a Hamas terrorist is responsible for his parents' terror activities. Nobody is responsible for what anybody did prior to their own birth, nor is it her fault or responsibility that she was born when and where she was. A child, a new generation, is a fresh start, a do-over in the most profound metaphysical and ethical ways. So keep this child in mind now as we next consider the question of how to rectify large-scale historical injustices. Take your pick. There's no shortage of large-scale historical injustices. I'll give you a list in a moment. Obviously, unfortunately, we have no time machine, no way to literally go back in time and undo the event, prevent it from happening. Uncountably many innocent lives have been lost and shattered in every terrorist act and every war, but there's just no way now to make September 11th not have happened, or the Vietnam War, or the two world wars, or the Civil War, or the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which curiously is pretty much the only historical event that large numbers of people ever seem interested in undoing. So unfortunately, that's off the table. This method of rectifying the injustice is not available. The next best thing would be to compensate those individuals who actually suffered the injustice. But if the injustice involved their death, that's also impossible. And even for those who survive the injustice, they die off too as the event gradually sinks into history. If there are ways to identify and compensate any remaining survivors of specific concrete injustices, by all means, that's something worth pursuing. The most plausible mode of rectification for some large-scale historical injustice, then, maybe the only plausible mode, is to compensate not the individuals who suffered the injustices, but their descendants. And that's where things immediately get really tricky. First, from whom exactly should they receive their compensation? Presumably from descendants of those who perpetrated the original injustice. But a child, we just saw, is a fresh start, a do-over, who cannot be held responsible for the sins of her forebears. It seems very unjust to demand compensation from someone who was in no way responsible for the injustice in question. Nor, although this is more complex, is it obvious that the descendant of the original victim should actually be entitled to anything, period, especially as the generations go on. If a new child is not responsible for the sins of her ancestors, neither is she deserving of any of the merits or blessings or property of the ancestor, nor is she automatically entitled, by virtue of being born, to restitution of something that may have once belonged to an ancestor or compensation for something that may have happened to an ancestor. Obviously, where there's some concrete property in question and an enduring legal system, there may be laws governing inheritance, and so that's not what we're talking about here. The fact that something unjust happened to my grandparents, or they were unjustly deprived of something, does not automatically mean that I am owed anything. I did not suffer the loss, after all. Nothing was taken from me. I was born long afterwards into the new reality created subsequent to the loss, a fresh start. So the immediate and obvious objection would be to offer a counterfactual sentence. Imagine how things might have been had things gone differently, right? Well, if the loss hadn't occurred, then I would have been born into a better situation. So I did, after all, suffer the loss or suffer from the loss myself. If so, then maybe I am entitled to some sort of restitution or compensation. That would be the objection to what I've just argued. Maybe in response, but this objection opens up a whole set of problems, makes things actually even more complicated and worse. Once you begin opening counterfactuals in this way, then almost anything goes. If the loss hadn't occurred, then many things would have been different. A whole other course of life would have ensued, and who can know what that may have included? Just imagine if the 1948 war had not occurred, if the Arabs had simply accepted partition, everything would have been different. Many of the people who died wouldn't have died. Many of the people who met their spouses afterwards would have met other spouses. People who are alive today wouldn't be alive today because they never would have been born because their ancestors would never have met, right? Perhaps in the new course of life, your grandfather would have been hit by a truck or died of a heart attack or just simply never met your grandmother and you would never have been born. But if you owe your very existence to the loss, you cannot claim that the loss somehow harmed you. Had the loss not occurred, you wouldn't have existed. Or perhaps if the loss hadn't occurred, you would have ended up even worse off than you in fact are. Maybe the loss actually improved your current conditions. So, for example, millions of people have become refugees. It's a horrible, unjust loss to almost every refugee. Millions of people have become refugees and they end up resettling elsewhere, including, for example, in the United States, where their children or grandchildren eventually end up with much better lives than they would have had their ancestors simply stayed put in the home country. So in that case, the loss actually benefits the person. The ancestors' loss benefits the descendants, right? Even if we grant that the historical loss resulted in a negative, um, outcome for you, it's not clear even that that outcome can be blamed entirely or even maximally on the loss itself. In the case of the Palestinian refugees, for example, even if we grant that their contemporary conditions are poor, which is not necessarily the case, should we blame those conditions on the 1948 war or on the 75 years of their mistreatment and mismanagement since at the hands of the refugee agency UNRWA, much in the news in the past year or so? Moreover, why isolate only that single counterfactual concerning your grandfather? What if your grandfather himself had acquired the thing in question by some unjust means, or inherited it from people higher up the ancestral ladder who had done so? As you go up that ladder, there are many, many injustices to be found, maybe in great quantities, particularly given the long history of human warfare, imperialism, and conquest, even in that region, in the Near East, the Middle East, right? So if you insist that the descendant of the person who stole it from your grandfather doesn't have a rightful claim to it, then what happens to your grandfather's claim to it if he only had it because one of his ancestors had stolen it from somebody else? Should we go all the way back up to the 7th century Muslim Arab invasion and conquest of this region, where they took the land from the people who were living there then, who were presumably descendants of something like the 1st century Roman invasion and conquest of the region, who took it, of course, from the Jews? So should we go all the way back to the Jews and return all the land to the Jews or the descendants thereof? If we insist on root causes, we should go all the way back to the roots. So yes, maybe you would have been born into a better situation had one particular injustice not occurred, but you equally might have been born into a worse situation had all sorts of other injustices not occurred. If you're contemplating counterfactuals and undoing history, justice requires undoing them all. If your grandparents did something unjust to my grandparents then, that does not automatically give me a claim against you. You didn't do anything and I didn't suffer anything. More broadly, the fact that one community did something unjust towards another community does not entail that all future generations of the latter have legitimate claims against all future generations of the former. In fact, if we get quantitative and acknowledge the enormous growth in the populations since these injustices occurred, then it's hard to avoid the conclusion that demanding compensation from later descendants of the original injustice doers would end up perpetrating against them an even greater injustice than the original one their ancestors perpetrated. And it could hardly be just to demand the rectification of some historical injustice by means of some even greater contemporary injustice. Let's repeat that point in the conclusion. It is not just to demand the rectification of some historical injustice by means of some even greater contemporary injustice. And to apply that point directly, in short, what anti-Zionists want today in the dismantling of the state of Israel, and certainly if that includes the murder and ethnic cleansing of the 7 million Jews who live in that Israel, etc., that would amount to an even greater injustice against them than the alleged injustice their ancestors had perpetrated in 1948, assuming we're granting that false claim. All right. Still not convinced? I anticipate as much. There's more arguments. Even if you still have the intuition after everything I just said, that later descendants of injustice victims should have such claims for compensation, trying to accommodate those claims would literally be both impossible to do and a formula for disaster. If we inherit both the sins and the claims of our ancestors, then we will all live in a perpetual Hatfields versus McCoy's world in which everyone ultimately has a claim against everybody else. World history, both distant and recent, features massive injustices on inconceivable scales. As Arab intellectual Hussein Abdul Hussein has put it on social media, he's a wonderful person to follow. He has incredible moral clarity. As he's put it, everybody's grandfather lost something. So everybody will have various multiple claims to compensation. And let's not forget, if we're counting claims to compensation, the Jewish victims too. So even if we restrict ourselves to this conflict, which I like to refer to as the Israeli-Palestinian Jewish-Arab-Muslim-Iran conflict, or IPJAMIC, which is precisely as complicated as that name and acronym suggests, even if we restrict ourselves to the IPJAMIC, even where we're counterfactually granting that the Jews came from outside and took it over via ethnic cleansing, who exactly were these perpetrator Jews, quote unquote? In the standard anti-Israel narrative, these Jews came from Europe, whence they fled as refugees, escaping what? The massive injustice of persecution and pogroms. A simple glance at 19th century European anti-Semitism, culminating in mass murderous pogroms of 1881 and 1903, amongst others, not to mention 1930s Germany and the Holocaust, will easily demonstrate this point. Add to these, of course, the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were forced out of Arab and Islamic lands due to persecution and pogroms, leaving behind lives and much property. These Jews were all victims of mass injustice, even if on the anti-Israel narrative, they then allegedly victimized the innocent Palestinian Arabs. So how can one demand that today's Israelis compensate today's Palestinian Arabs without also demanding that most Middle Eastern and North African countries compensate the Israelis? Throw in the fact that many Arabs themselves emigrated from those countries to Palestine in the 20th century, and they and or their immediate relatives may well even have participated in the persecution and pogroms of the Jews who fled those countries. So today's Palestinians also owe something to today's Israeli Jews. You can't just select one. If you're compensating victims of injustice, you have to compensate all victims of injustice. As Hussein Abdul Hussein put it, everybody's grandfather lost something. To look backward, to maintain and pursue all those claims, is only a formula for propagating violence and instability. All the more so as we step a little bit closer to reality and acknowledge the actual long history of Jews in the land of Israel, and remembering key point that at the time of the United Nations partition proposal in 1947, there were 0 Palestinian refugees. Remember that point, it's crucial. As of November 1947, when the United Nations passed the partition proposal, there were 0 refugees. Why is that important? Because it shows that Zionism itself, which culminates in the partition, Zionism itself displaced nobody. There was, in fact, enough room for everyone in Palestine until the Arabs launched the Civil War and then, of course, the Multi-Arab Army International War in 1948. In that process, 1% of the Jewish population died, lost their lives. Tens of thousands were injured. Jews were ethnically cleansed from those parts of the land that Egypt and Jordan conquered, and so on. So even if the Jewish immigration into the land, which happened to displace nobody, were itself an injustice somehow, consider the disproportionate injustice perpetrated against them in the murderous military and terrorist activity that followed. If the Arab descendants of 1948 have a legitimate claim against the Jews of 2023, then surely the Jews of 2023 have similarly legitimate claims against the contemporary Arabs. So there may well have been some massive injustice in the past. There's no shortage of massive injustices, but it's literally impossible to undo that injustice. And any efforts to compensate for the injustice will only perpetrate further, almost surely greater injustices, if not directly sink the whole region into a pre-modern state of nature, a war of all against all, in which literally everybody loses. So again, the conclusion, everybody's grandfather lost something. And so unless we accept the idea that every new child is a fresh start, then everybody has a claim against everybody. We're in a madhouse state of nature, war of all against all, and all is lost. All right, there's another way of making this point worth pursuing in the time that we have. Decolonization and collective punishment. This is important for those following carefully the campus scene post-October 7th. Many of those who justified the October 7th massacre did so on the basis of supporting decolonization. That's like a big catchword in the academy these days, really over the last couple of decades. As one representative professor put it, very well-known anti-Zionist, I would say anti-Semite, Mark Lamont Hill of CUNY, put it shortly after the massacre, so many academics who insist upon doing performative virtues signaling land acknowledgments at every public event are eerily silent as real liberation struggles are happening. I guess decolonization really is just a metaphor for some folk. Excuse me. He clearly derides those people who are all talk and no action. So for him, at least, decolonization justifies the slaughter of October 7th. Similarly, Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the main campus student group, it's a national campus group with over 200 chapters on many universities now, they defended the massacre by proclaiming that, quote, decolonization is a call to actions that go beyond rhetoric, including resistance in all forms, including armed struggle. And they illustrated their social media with images of the homicidal hang gliders in case anybody missed the point. So all that slaughter, October 7th, that massacre, that barbaric massacre, is apparently fine as long as it's for decolonization. By any means necessary, decolonization is good. This is their view. But now these same people who openly celebrated October 7th and justified it in the way just described have spent the months since October 7th angrily demanding a ceasefire, meaning that Israel should cease its military activity against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Among their main arguments for supporting this ceasefire is that this military activity, they say, constitutes collective punishment against the civilians of Gaza, who they claim were not responsible for Hamas's actions and therefore shouldn't be punished by the war in Gaza. Now, there's much to be critiqued in that argument, including its presumption about civilian innocence, etc., and its poor grasp of the norms of international law and warfare. But let's grant them the principle that collective punishment is morally objectionable, i.e. unjust, for it surely is unjust to punish people who are not themselves responsible for the injustice for which they are being punished. as we've just been arguing. That is, of course, just the point. For now, what is this ongoing decolonization campaign against Israel, in particular in the October 7th massacre manifestation, targeting mostly Jewish civilians, including babies and children, but a massive example of the injustice of collective punishment? Even if we grant that 1948 was an injustice, those babies and children, those dancing teenagers, and almost every single one of the 1,200 killed on that day could in no way be held responsible for 1948. They were born long afterward. And even if they were, as that MIT student quoted, partying on stolen land, as those antagonists would have it, they were in no way responsible for that. They were born there to parents who were born there, to parents who were probably born there, and so on, and have every right to be there, to be raised there, to live there, to dance there, and of course to defend themselves from the violence directed against them. Nor do the Hamas militants have any right to reclaim that land from them, for they themselves were born long after it was allegedly stolen, and may well themselves be the descendants of colonizers who stole that land from others. The entire anti-Israel campaign is one large campaign of collective punishment against the vast majority of contemporary Israeli Jews. Like it or not, there is simply no way to violently undo Israel and thus to rectify or compensate for the alleged injustice of 1948 that does not perpetrate an equal or likely even far greater overall injustice. Okay, a very short legal interlude. I've got about 7 minutes looking at the clock there. So this is not the place for a full legal brief, but it's worth mentioning this because this is a very active point in campus discussions of these matters. It's widely discussed and widely misunderstood. Detractors, anti-Israel folks, are fond of the principle that resistance to occupation, apartheid, etc., including by any means necessary, is justified by international law. This is what they claim. Even armed struggle, violent resistance to these sins is justified by international law. When pressed for a legal source for that principle, they will invoke United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3743 from 1982, in particular the clause that, quote, reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. So if you followed that long sentence, that kind of sounds like it's legitimate. Armed struggle is legitimate against things like occupation, colonial and foreign domination and occupation. With this in hand, along with that counterfactually granted assumption that the establishment of Israel was unjust, and the contemporary claim that Israel occupies Palestine either in part or whole, which we have challenged in earlier lectures, it's a very small step to openly justifying the October 7th massacre as if it's legal by international law, except that that is entirely wrong. It's false, incorrect, a lie. Go that far. First, General Assembly resolutions, which I just was quoting, do not have the force of law according to international law. They are merely recommendations. But far more importantly, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which does have the force of law, it is considered a foundation of international law, is precisely designed to protect civilians, non-combatants, in the time of war. Article 33 is unambiguous. No protected person, i.e. civilian, may be punished for an offense that he or she has not personally committed. Collective penalties and all measures of intimidation or of terrorism are prohibited. End quote. There is no exception to this rule. The additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, Article 51.2, is even more explicit. Quote, the civilian population, including individual civilians, shall not be the object of attack. End quote, period. No exceptions. The article then goes on to prohibit, proscribe almost every sort of action that Hamas undertook on October 7th, including hostage taking, and has generally undertaken in its years of terrorist activity. Even further, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1566 in the year 2004, passed under Chapter 7, a technical point that means it has the force of international law once again, condemns all acts of terror, quote, irrespective of motivation, end quote, and states explicitly that, quote, criminal acts, including against civilians, committed with the intent to cause death or serious bodily injury or the taking of hostages, are under no circumstances justifiable by considerations of a political, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or other similar nature. You can't get clearer than that. Acts targeting civilians are under no circumstances justifiable by any considerations. Right. And finally, that same year, addressing the same issues, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan determined that, quote, there is nothing in the fact of occupation that justifies the targeting and killing of civilians, end quote. So even if we grant 1948 was an injustice, even if we grant that Israel's occupying parts of Palestine or all of Palestine in the extremist version, none of which is true, but even if we grant that, this violence directed against civilians, such as October 7th barbaric terrorist atrocities, is illegal. It is illegal according to international law. You don't get any clearer than that. So what should we do in the 3 minutes that we have? Just enough time. I wish I could solve the problem. Of course I can't. What is left to do for those seeking some resolution to the IPJAMIC? Well, answering that is obviously beyond the scope of this talk, but one thing does seem clear. Thomas Hobbes, famous 17th century political philosopher, himself suggested that when transitioning from that pre-modern state of nature, where it's war of everyone against everybody, into civil society, the parties have to find a way to get over past grievances and commit themselves to some form of forward-looking social contract. In his famous work, Leviathan, he provides what he calls some laws of nature, which are general rules, rational rules that people need to follow. The sixth law states that upon caution of the future time, a man ought to pardon the offenses past of them that repenting desire it, i.e., if they repent, forgive. And the seventh law quite poignantly says that in deciding how to respond to past offenses, we must look, quote, not at the greatness of the evil past, but the greatness of the good to follow, end quote. That obviously means that we have to look more forward than looking back, and it would require working with the Jews and Israelis rather than trying to physically eliminate them as Hamas did and to dismantle Zionism as the campus crowd does. So once again, I'll close with this long quote from Hussein Abdul Hussein, who, after rehearsing the history of violent Palestinian rejectionism that has repeatedly led to disastrous results for the Palestinians as well as the Israelis, basically says it's time to get past the cycle of violence. And it just the concluding line of this long quote says it's high time for the Arab elite and intellectuals to break this cycle, learn from the past, let go of the worthless Palestine cause, and focus on a better present and future. So even if most or all of what they claimed about the founding of Israel were true, and it is not, no amount of those alleged grievances could justify what happened on October 7th, root causes and all. And until the detractors start looking forward rather than looking back, prospects for peace, much less prosperity, are quite dim. So let's hope that the end of 2024 will be the beginning of 2025 rather than the continuation of 1948. So thank you. There's all that contact information again. Happy to see if there's any questions or comments and do my best to address them.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting and very insightful. And we're turning to questions now. You can submit questions using the Q&A box on your screen. We're going to start with two questions that are kind of related. One of them is, how does compensation to Holocaust victims fit into this paradigm? And the other one, which is very similar, regarding large-scale historical injustice, would this mean that the descendants of European Jews murdered in the Holocaust should not be entitled to receiving the valuable artwork stolen by the Nazis?
Those are great questions. You know, those are wonderful questions. And I don't know that I have good I've thought of the questions, haven't necessarily worked out good thought out answers to it. It's also clearly connected to today's debates about reparations and things like that, right?
Mhm.
So the first thing to say is the further past the event, the less plausible any concept of compensation or reparation is. That's obviously vague. I'm not going to be, precise. It's not possible to be precise. So as we think about reparations for slavery, for example, if those date back 200 years at this point, they are certainly sketchier than compensation for something that happened last year or last week, right? So the more recent the event, the more plausible. The many of the parties are still alive. The property in question is still there. Things like that. And indeed, the main debate over Holocaust compensation that was occurring in Israel, right? It was a very vexed question in Israel in the 1950s into the 1960s. The Holocaust was still quite recent there, and that made it plausible. As far as specific artworks, that is it's complicated. What I want to say is, of course, return the artworks to the descendants of the families. That's the intuition. Um, and there's a concrete piece of property, and the chain of possession can be traced. Something along those lines can help justify that. So, what makes it complicated is there isn't an enduring legal system. I could see people raising questions to that. So rather than try to answer that, I share the intuition in those cases that we want to maximize compensation. But as the years go on from the Holocaust, compensation for it makes less and less sense. It just simply does. When we have concrete objects like works of art that were in a family and you can trace the chain of command, I think you can begin to make the exception argument for that kind of thing. Unlike what, of course, that makes it not comparable to the anti-Zionist claim, because what anti-Zionists want to do right now is essentially either murder or ethnically cleanse 7 million Israeli Jews and just flood Israel with a whole bunch of people who never lived there to return to places that no longer exist, right? So the two cases are quite different, which would maybe allow me to distinguish them. But I do think I need to do some more thought on that particular question. Thank you for it.
Well, thank you. That was an amazing answer.
Okay.
Um, okay, a slightly unrelated question, but this person says, my problem is not agreeing with your talk, but trying to engage with any pro-Palestinian group. They have a fixed agenda and are not open to discussion. When I put up my hand, I get kicked out of the meeting. Any suggestions?
Thank you for that. I'm with you on that. I find I let me. I don't know that I have good suggestions. I'm a conflict averse person, so it's not my preferred activity to go into the lion's den and do battle with these folks. I end up doing it occasionally because it happens, given that I am a pretty vocal pro-Israel advocate. But I do not seek the direct confrontations. And I'm so grateful for those of us on our side who go right into the lion's den, toe to toe and go for it, including some important people on social media. Um, Let me, instead of answering that, because I don't think I have a tip other than maintain your dignity, try to distinguish between those people who are all in and those people who may be on the fence, and there is no point whatsoever ever in engaging with people who are all in, because nothing will be budged. But if you can find the person who is a little bit more on the fence or possibly open-minded or receptive, then go in full throttle and make your arguments, both refuting their narrative about 1948 and beyond, as well as, I don't know, try this one out. Say, so even if we grant it, point out the problems in demanding the compensation, see if it works. I will mention, I had a student at Connecticut College who clearly leans anti-Israel, but she reached out to me because of something I had written, and she had a lot of questions, and she said she wanted to learn more. And those are the wonderful moments. She has her I'll call it her starting point. Her starting intuitions are to side with the Palestinians and what she knows of the conflict. But that's a person who is open and honest and has enough integrity to say, she's a student, I'm a professor. Maybe she can learn something from me. I don't know that I will persuade her to change her mind, but at the very least, I will force her to consider a whole bunch. Force her sounds strong, but I will encourage her to consider a whole bunch of things that might change her mind, and let the mind changing happen on her side, not by me. So those are the people we want to find, and those are the people we want to communicate with. And I think you, as the questioner probably agrees, I don't know, does it take 3 seconds or 5 seconds to figure out who you're dealing with, right? Right. The way they speak, the confidence, and mostly the anger and hostility, right? The ones that just come right out enraged at you, pretty clear you're not going to make any headway with that person. The person who's calmer and maybe has the capacity then to listen and hear something. So those are the people that you want to engage with.
Okay, so this relates to a couple of our questions. I'm going to go with one that's like so related. Do you feel there's been any improvement in the campus culture for Jewish students and faculty since October 7th, 2023, or is it getting worse?
So I have to make that question a little bit more precise. So I've been following these issues for a long time, really closely since about 2015 when I was myself targeted in an anti-Zionist campaign, and that was, as I like to say, the scholar Gil Troy, very important guy. He refers to it as, people have their Herzl moment, the moment when your eyes open and you suddenly see the anti-Semitism, in particular in anti-Zionism. So my Herzl moment was back in 2015, and I suddenly saw that anti-Zionism, in a phrase, is anti-Semitism, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So I've been following the scene since 2015 quite closely on campuses, and the trajectory has just been going downhill slope, worse and worse and worse and worse, with each passing year getting more frightening and potentially violent. And I was ready for, after 2021, there was a brief Israel-Hamas war, you might recall, in I believe May of 2021. And looking at the campus response then, thank God that war was brief, but I was sure pogroms were ready to happen on campuses in 2021. But that war ended quickly, so that, put things back to a simmer from the raging boil that they were in. When October 7th came, I was actually not at all surprised by the campus response. And by the campus response, I'm referring to wide scale open celebration and calls for more of October 7th on many, many campuses, not all, many, many campuses, especially the most elite campuses and prestigious campuses. I was not at all surprised because it was literally the next step. If I had been graphing it, it would have been the next point in the trajectory, and it happened exactly as I predicted. It was no less shocking, just because I anticipated and wasn't surprised. It was shocking to actually see, but it was not surprising. So following the trajectory, it's just been going pretty much straight downhill. All of last academic year was, excuse the French, a shit show from the perspective of Jews or people who care about Israel. And I would argue anyone who cares about Western civilization and liberalism. That's a different, bigger conversation. Last year was horrific. As far as I can see, the current academic year, so if that's what the question is asking, are things better? That presumably means in the current academic year, 24-25, that we're just hitting winter break in. Um, it is not as bad this semester overall as it was last year. There's been things have calmed down to a degree, but there's plenty of hot spots, and it could flare up again any moment. Obviously, the big wild card and all that is the new administration coming in, which, at least by its rhetoric, is promising to seriously clamp down on campus misbehavior. That could have either of two very opposite effects. It could succeed in clamping down on campus behavior, or it could just make it explode because now, they're all pissed and angry at being oppressed. So it's a little hard to know. I'm actually optimistic, based not just on the rhetoric, but on some of the personnel and the policies, and the trends. Universities are more afraid now of allowing these students utterly free license to take over a campus and terrorize their Jewish communities. They are pushing back, and I think the new administration, at least the rhetoric and the personnel, suggest there are serious threats to universities that will allow this behavior to continue. So I'm actually feeling optimistic that the concrete behavior will diminish. It will never entirely go away, but it will diminish. However, that's a false, I don't know, a false sense of optimism, because the problems are all still there. Even if the people are not rallying on campus calling for the death of Jews, that's what they're thinking. That's what they're feeling. They're going to graduate and they're going to get jobs and they're going to become the next generation's leaders. They're going to go into Congress. They're going to go into the New York Times. This worldview is built into the current generation, and the long-term trajectory for American society beyond campus looks very, very dark to me, to be honest. So we have a momentary lull with the new administration, but what I guess I don't want to call this a positive consequence, but what's happened is what we've seen is all the hatred of Jews that has been just below the surface simmering came out in the open. We've all seen it now, the anti-Semitism, and maybe they'll clamp it down a little bit, but once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And these very same people already, the class of 2024 who were leading those encampments, graduated and they've gotten jobs and they're clerking for justices. They're moving into the legal system. I mean, so we have anti-Semitism is going to be spreading outwards into the echelons of the leadership of our society. So it's very frightening time ahead. Sorry, that was a little depressing, but that's how I see it.
Well, we actually probably have time for one more question.
Sure.
But and on this note, I guess the one that's most relevant, what is the response to those who advocate for a one-state solution for which Jews, of course, is untenable?
So I'm not sure I understood the last part of that question. For Jews, it's untenable, meaning Jews could not advocate for the one-state solution? Is that we don't know? You just have a written question.
Yeah.
Okay. So, there's two different versions of the one state solution. The one version is the Jewish version, where Israel has sovereignty over all of the contested territories, including or not including Gaza, depending on your version, and obviously Judea, Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank. I think we should use Judea, Samaria for many reasons. The other version is what you hear, and this is it used to just be the minority, but now it's not only the majority, it is like the universal anti-Israel position is the one-state solution, Palestine. And depending on just how extreme the person you're talking to is, it's a Palestine that will be a binational state of full equality for all its citizens, which literally not one person believes in is feasible or possible. Or it will be a Palestinian state, but they won't kill their Jews if you're a relatively moderate version of that. Or more likely, it would be a Palestinian state which would murder and expel many hundreds of thousands of Jews, right? Um, so which version? It's hard for me personally, to imagine a two-state solution in the immediate future. I do think October 7th makes that unfeasible and untenable. Um, the whole past track record shows clearly that as every time Israel withdraws from territory, whether it's southern Lebanon or Gaza or most of the West Bank, that territory is turned into a terrorist hotbed that produces more violence against Israel. It actually empowers the people who want to perpetrate the violence. Everyone says give them territory and then there'll be peace, two states. But the track record actually shows when they get territory, they use it to advance the war against Israel. So if you actually are a Zionist and believe there should be an Israel, to me, there's no practical possibility, at least in the immediate future, the next few years, of a two-state solution. You know, there's some extreme folks out there who are calling for a Jewish one-state solution that would have some form of ethnic cleansing. Almost no American Jews could tolerate or abide that, but there's, I think, a lot more to be said about that position. There's a new party in the upcoming World Zionist Congress, uh, spearheaded or motivated by Ambassador David Friedman's new book, which is called One Jewish State, which is advocating a one Jewish state solution to this region. I urge people to look at it with an open mind. Read the book. The book is actually really interesting. He's got a lot of interesting ideas. There's now a party representing this position in the World Zionist Congress. I actually think it's important to get behind that party, even if you don't agree with it, simply to move the needle a little bit more rightward. I think the needle is way too far left right now, personally, needs to get back to the center. But I urge folks to just read Ambassador Friedman's new book, One Jewish State, with an open mind. You may not agree, you may not like it, but what is the solution? One Palestinian state is a disaster for the Jewish people. Two states is practically impossible for the Jewish people, at least I would even say for the next generation. So what's the alternative? A one Jewish state. So at least think about it, like learn a little bit about it, try to figure out how that could work in a way that might be consistent with whatever your liberal, our liberal principles are. So promised I wouldn't solve the IPJAMIC tonight, and I've lived up to that promise.
Well, thank you so much. You had a lot to say and a lot of interesting things. Um, so we want to thank you, and for our people today who are watching us, please consider donating towards Scholars Circle and remember that your donation is tax deductible. Our next Scholars Circle features Dr. Sofia Moskalenko. The topic will be deadly disinformation, the role of ideology in political violence. So please join us Monday, December 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And thank you, Dr. Pessin, and thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.